So this is a fireside chat. So the topic we want to explore over the next hour and 15 minutes is consumer sentiment for change. And the thesis is really thinking through, one, what is consumer sentiment? How is it collected in qualitative and quantitative forms? And then how can it be used to drive change, whether that is change in consumer purchasing behavior or change in the behavior of folks within the social sector. Any type of behavior change we'd like. So with that, I would like to introduce briefly each of the panelists. We have Catherine Havasi, who you've also met, but just in case. Catherine Havasi, CEO of Luminoso, Bill Wilkie, founder of Story, and David Rabjon, CEO of MotiveQuest. What I would like to do is to ask each of you to begin with a brief 3 to 5 minute description of who you are, a bit about your background, why you think that consumer change, or consumer sentiment, is important, and what the role that you see it playing in driving behavior change. So David, if I could ask you to begin.
Thanks. Hi. So I don't know if anybody's noticed this, but I'm not from the social sector, but I am in the social world. I actually started my career in IBM, PepsiCo, was at Lea Burnett for a lot of years, and the thing that I focused my career on is understanding what makes people tick. So that's what I do for a living. I try and understand, why do people do the things they do? What drives behavior? And in 2003, I got very excited about social big data. And this was at a time before Facebook, before Twitter. But I began to swim around in the early days of news groups and realized that this social big data is an absolutely brilliant place to understand what makes people tick and what will drive their behaviors. So I started a company. My company is 10 years old this year. And all we do is analyze what's going on in big social data for companies like Microsoft and Ford and Nike and General Mills, trying to work out, why are their customers doing what they're doing? What are the gaps in the marketplace? What are the needs that they have that are met? And how can they serve those needs? Now, the really interesting thing about all of that is I'm constantly tripping over information in those studies that I'm doing that are relevant to things like how to solve poverty, how to serve the social sector, and I just wanted to talk about a few of those stories, to give you an example of the sorts of ways you can analyze that data and the sorts of things you can learn. So one of the first that I remember, we were doing a study for General Mills, and it was right after the recession. And General Mills was interested. General Mills makes, Lucky Charms and Cheerios and all of that stuff. And they were very interested in, how are people dealing with the recession? How are they dealing with having less money in their pockets? How are they dealing with prices going up or down? And how are they adjusting for this so they can feed their families? And so we took our software, think of it like a giant electronic blanket. And we laid this electronic blanket over all the conversations that were happening in America around food, shopping, price. And we said, what's going to bubble to the surface? So we watched what bubbled to the surface. And you saw all these fascinating strategies bubbling to the surface. Some people were doing bulk buying, where what they would do, they would group together, and one woman in a group or a guy in a group would go and buy toilet paper. And they'd stack all the toilet paper up in their garage. And somebody else would go and buy cans of soup. And somebody else would go and buy something else. And they'd come together through social networks to collaborate with each other to work out how could they buy things more cheaply in order to deal with their price challenges and their how to feed the family kind of challenges. Some people were getting very sophisticated around credit cards. They were finding out, they were gaming the system. They were working out which are the cards that can give me the best rebates on gas. And they were sharing this information among themselves across their communities and saying, hey, you need to go get this card, because if you use this card, you can actually buy your gas at the same price that it used to be 3 weeks ago before the price went up. So you can continue to afford gas to drive to work. And we even did a study, I remember, we were working for the state of California, and they were interested in meth users and how to reduce meth usage. And, we went into the study thinking, there's no meth users on social media. And what we found is an incredible dialogue going on. Who knew? Between meth users and former meth users. Meth users actually use social media very actively to cross-shop drugs. So meth isn't the only drug they take. They cross-shop coke, heroin, PCP against each other and say, which is going to give me the biggest bang for the buck? So just like consumers, they cross-shop meth. And then post-meth users were online talking to the current meth users, actually talking about, look, this is how it impacted my life. This is how it changed my life. And what we found is that pretty much all of the communication the state of California was putting out there to meth users was derided and useless, right? It really wasn't having an impact. But this community of former meth users talking to meth users about how meth changed their lives was really impactful in changing their behaviors. And so, we were able to surface that data just by laying the blanket over the conversations that exist. And so I think that to answer the question of how does sentiment affect behavior, I would answer that by saying that actually understanding what sentiments people are expressing really is like the question earlier on is like, what value does data have? It doesn't have a lot of value. Unless you can answer the question, by analyzing that data, can I understand why people are doing the things they're doing? Why are women talking about their garage when they're talking about how to feed their family? Why are meth users talking about heroin when they're talking about meth? That's the stuff that we do that's really interesting, and you can dig down into the data. You can use all sorts of clever linguistic algorithms to understand why are people doing the things they're doing, and from that you can actually predict behavior. So I've found that to be a fascinating endeavor. And I think in terms of poverty, one of the most interesting things is if you think about a world that traditionally had the haves and the have-nots, and the haves didn't just have money, but they had information. And the have-nots didn't just have a lack of money, but they had a lack of information. What social has done is democratized information. So a customer of mine, Lowe's, for example, it's amazing. You've got guys making YouTube videos, not Lowe's employees, regular customers of Lowe's making YouTube videos to show people how to fix their toilet. Suddenly, you don't need a plumber to come and fix your toilet if you're living in your house. You can go to YouTube and you can see how to fix your toilet. If you're trying to work out how to feed your family and times are hard and you've lost your job, you don't necessarily need to sort of just struggle with that on your own. You can reach out to whole communities of people that's all they're thinking about is how to make the most out of a dollar. And so I think the social age, not just social media, the social age is all about democratization of information across the planet. And that idea of democratization of information across the planet and the analysis of that information has a huge opportunity to change the world. So that's what I see from poking around trying to help capitalists get rich. And the side slurry of that is all of this information that can be helpful to everybody else in the world. So.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Catherine.
All right. So I guess I'm coming at this from sort of two hats, one of which is that I am a data scientist and I'm running Luminoso, which is a text understanding company. Beyond that, I've taught data at MIT, and I'm running a very large open data project called ConceptNet, if people here have heard of this, or Open Mind Common Sense, which is started in 1999 and began collecting using crowdsourcing what would become known as crowdsourcing and big data and many other things. So we started collecting the knowledge that people had, but computers didn't. So things like the sun is very hot and people want to be respected. To actually understand this in a nutshell, if you think about the sentence, I went to the grocery store, and you think about an analytics program that wants to understand that sentence, there's so many things you need to know to actually know what that means. And you need to know that you have to bring money to the grocery store to actually accomplish anything. You need to exchange money for goods and services. The grocery store is full of food, but nobody really eats their dinner there. The floor is going to hold your weight when you're in the grocery store. All these kinds of things. No one thinks you're food in the grocery store, even though you're in the grocery store, all the food. So computers need to be able to understand these things, because when people communicate and they're talking about things they're passionate about, they try to become interesting. And in linguistic philosophy, basically, there's this tenet that essentially says, we want to make sure we're interesting to everybody around us. So we don't repeat knowledge that we assume other people have. And we're creative in the way we speak. And this is especially true when we're talking about things that we're passionate about. So we try to add that back into the machine. So we've been collecting this knowledge for about 15 years now. We have 17 million data points now, and we put it back into the machine. So in the same sense, I keep hearing people talking about building repositories and knowledge bases and things like that. We've been doing that a really long time. And there's all kinds of interesting things you learn along that process, which is there's a lot of little niggly bits that make it really difficult to do that. Like, one of which is putting all the data into a format that people can use, making it accessible, making it reliable, all of these different problems. And as we, as OpenMind, talk to people in open data, open government, and data journalism about how to build these corpuses, we're starting to realize that it's becoming more and more possible to put more data into a repository that other people can use. So that's one of the hats that I have. The other one is obviously Luminoso, which I'll get more into in a second. And the third one is that previously I was a social entrepreneur in education. So I started a company called Learning Unlimited, which is a nonprofit that many people, if you know of it as the Splash program, which brings local middle and high school students into college campuses, and they are taught classes by those middle and high school students. So I know I've done a little bit of education work, but not usually overlapping with data. And I think it's interesting. And as we start talking about sentiment, one of the things that I want to emphasize is we need to go a little bit beyond sentiment. So traditionally, people think of sentiment as sort of this positive-negative balance. And it's very exciting where you can take many things that you couldn't put numbers on before, and now you can put a number on it, which is sentiment. And that's transformed a lot of industries. People probably saw the movie Moneyball. It always gets used in data analytics. So I will bring that up as well, as long as I can bring up the caveat that everybody uses it. But I think the interesting thing about sentiment is you need to understand, well, how predictive is it with regards to the actual metrics that people are using? And we have a lot of if we look at things like the Delta Breaks guitar story or various different social media disasters that have happened over the years, not all of them have had any long-term impact. Like Delta's stock went up right after that. Have not had any long-term impact on the company. So we need to go beyond sentiment. And again, as you pointed out, we need to look at the whys. So we need to say, well, everybody loves this commercial, everybody loves this initiative, but is there some reason for that? Can we understand if that has any brand impact? So actually being able to dig deeper and do real linguistic analysis is as important as sentiment. And I want to emphasize that because as we start looking, the social sphere starts looking at, the way the commercial sphere has done with data, everybody's going to tend to start emphasizing things like sentiment that are very hot there right now, but I want to caution a little bit to say sentiment without other metrics is a little bit, can lead to some false results. Because of course, if something is happening in a community, everyone's going to be excited about it, but that doesn't necessarily impact how long-term change will happen. Along with Luminoso, we've done a lot of work with health. So we tend to work a little bit in the university sphere, but a lot in the sort of consumer health sphere with helping companies understand how people think about their health. And a lot of that has to do with being able to say, well, what makes people comfortable? What are people afraid of? What motivates people to make changes in the way they're acting with their health? And I think that's definitely something that consumer sentiment can look at that is beneficial to both the commercial sphere and to the social sphere. But we can get into any number of these things in questions.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Wilkie, you're on.
Me, I'm on. Can't remember what I was going to talk about. See, I'm Bill. Let me start at the beginning. I studied music, and I'm interested in theory and improvisation. That was my thing. So I've been in this left brain, right brain space a long time, analysis and creativity. And then I went and got 2 degrees in religion. And like you, I'm not making that up, and like you, I'm interested in how people tick. And the way I would talk, what makes people tick, I'm interested in how people make meaning and how they frame it and how they express it and codify it and fight over it and morph it and that kind of stuff. And closely related to that is value, both economic and ethical. So I surprised everyone and I went into advertising. So I spent the last 25 years, I can imagine the meaning. Meaning, yes, how they make meaning.
And then he said ethical and advertising.
That's right.
The two next to each other.
That's right, I did, together, yes. So I went to Yale Divinity School, studied theology, concentrated in ethics, and then I went to J. Walter Thompson 6 weeks later. And then it's been therapy ever since, but I'm not here to talk about that. So I'm very interested actually in the stories and frameworks that we live inside. So I did that for 25 years in different contexts. I did it in advertising, big agencies. I've done it with design firms. I've been doing it in the social sector. I've been also working in the sustainability space a lot and trying to do some thought leadership and publishing there as well. I'll get into some examples in a minute. But that's what's got me there. And I want to start with maybe a couple of fly in the ointment statements. One is that I don't think sentiment is an adequate word because it's really about emotion. And I think that so you start getting to this, well, reason versus emotion, rational versus emotional branding. Reason's more important. How do we understand rational? I think it's part of a bigger model, which is that I use, which is rational, emotional, cultural, social, and ethical. And I think that those five together make up our human experience, and it's what we bring to every brand, every experience, every product, every program. So the job of the strategist, which is what I am. I'm not a data guy. I use data. The job of the strategist is to understand consumers, beneficiaries, end users, cultures from that, within that framework. And others might have others. I'm sure he has one, and I assume it's no good. We've been egging each other all day. But no, but so
I'm going to ask you my question.
Yeah, you're going to have to. Go ahead. But that's what I use. And the reason I do it is because, and what I'm about is I don't, and here's my second kind of challenge, is that I don't think that we make strategy, or better yet, take action from data. I think we do it with data. And I think that there's been a bit of a tendency to say that we have a bunch of actions together, and that's a strategy. It isn't a strategy, it's a bunch of actions. And it's been informed by data. Well, terrific, it's been informed by data. But there has to be something in the middle, which for lack of a better word, we'll call strategy. And where I come from, that strategy has to be based on deep insights around those five dimensions I just mentioned. And don't ask me to mention them again, because I just made them up and I have no idea what they are. So I see the task as using the best data we can possibly use. And I'll tell you, in the last several years, data has gotten unbelievably powerful, and that's nothing but a good thing. So to use that data, but also use the best qualitative data we can use, because there's been a revolution in that in the last 15 years as well, where instead of asking direct questions and getting these useless answers, we're able to go below the surface and know things about people and cultures that they don't themselves know yet. So I'm an advocate for using both, using them equally, and then saying, terrific, I've got best in breed, best there is data of both kinds, but I'm only halfway there. Because at that point, I think we've got information, but we also need ideas and we need insights. And anybody working in my field who comes in with information and conclusions will and should get fired the next day. Because the job is to have insights and ideas as well. And then from that, we can start building, whether it's brands or designs or policies or programs. Now, the good news is these days we get real-time data, so we can make changes immediately. We can make them overnight. We can change the font if it's in advertising. We can do whatever we want. But what we can't change is the big narrative framework within which that lives. And my whole model is around narrative frameworks and narrative lenses. What really are the stories that we live inside? Because most of the time, we're not making rational decisions. We're not even making conscious decisions. Just to give you an example rationally, let's imagine, and I know this is going to be hell for some of you, but imagine that you and I are out on a date. And it's our first date. I know, get over it. I know, it's painful. And on the first date, I say, I Googled you, and I went on LinkedIn and Facebook, and I got a sock puppet, and I learned all this stuff, and I did it for me too, and it's really cool. Here's this printout. And I analyzed the data, and I've got these top 10 reasons you should be interested in me. And here's some other reasons I should be interested in you, and here's the language that comes up. And that's all great. And let's say it's all true. But it's not a thing you do on a first date, and it's not a reason to say, well, we should get married, and before we get married, maybe we should get a room. It's just not what you do. And to have, and I would argue that when we're trying to get consumer acceptance or audience acceptance, or and along with that momentum and the kind of accrued energy that comes from people liking it and talking about it, as you've talked about, we need to have, we need to build an us, just like a couple would. And you build an us by having rich narrative frameworks in which people live. That's why I call my business Story, with an I. That people will live within these frameworks, and from that we build strategy. So I'm actually trying to put the subjective back in a very big way. I think if you take it out, you've missed a step. So I think the most important thing to do is get the greatest data you can possibly get from every source. I'm absolutely thrilled by what's available, and even from the people in this room. Also to have great qualitative, because I know there's some geniuses out there at finding that kind of stuff. And then put it through the insight and idea thing. Now, how to do that, I don't have the time to talk about today, but we all have our different frameworks and models. I have a few I like. We've got coffee breaks, I could talk about them. But if I really want to get one thing across, it's that we make strategy and action plans with data, not from it. That there is a role that there's a crucial role for insight and ideas. That those are so far still somewhat subjective, because it takes a certain kind of creative mind, an analytical creative mind, to do it well. And that sentiment really should be broadened to be considered narrative, or frameworks. If you don't like the word narrative, you could just call it frameworks. And I think with that approach, we have the best opportunity to build things that people will get excited about, that they will talk about, that they will share, that they will accept, and that will ring true and resonate with them. And also, and this is a whole other conversation, weather certain storms, whether it's an ethical gaffe, a price increase, a major competitive move, whatever it might be. If you have that us that you've built, that's priceless. How to quantify it, I'm not sure yet, but we're working on it. And I'm going to steal him and, give him an injection, and we'll figure it out together. But then I'll take the credit. Anyway, so that's what I've got.
That's what happens in the ad business.
That's right.
I think it's definitely true that you always need both a data analytics tool, and you need data, but you also need somebody who's looking at that data, and somebody who has the context and the insight and all that kind of things.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot about what we know looking at things, that's what is important out of a data set, that's very, very hard to train against. And I think you're coming in this is especially true in marketing, you're coming in, you're looking for that story that you can tell, and you're going to find lots of things there, but they might not be the correct story.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. It's funny. Even years ago, like the first thing I would always do, maybe as a form of punishment, because I grew up Catholic, but I would say, give me all your data. Give me everything you have, and I'll just spend a week, 12 hours a day reading through it. And if the story was there, we'd stop. Got Milk is the famous one in advertising.
Yeah.
That wasn't a great big ethnographic, creative, qualitative inquiry that led to that. It was somebody, in our role, we have similar backgrounds, we were both planners and ad agencies, was sifting through that. And they noticed something that hadn't been noticed before, which is that nobody cares about milk except when they don't have milk. So that healthy bones and teeth stuff, it was over. It was saturated, everybody knew it. What they learned was that when you have cookies and no milk, that's a form of hell. So they created a spot, literally, with hell and flames and the whole deal. And the guy thinks he's in heaven, he's actually in hell. And so it's always about, is the story there? And to get off my soapbox in just 30 seconds, I think that there's a difference between a conclusion and an insight. Mm-hmm. And I think some models can give you conclusions, other models give you insights. And an insight, as I would define it, is a nonlinear jump. And I think that we do need those. But if we don't have great data to start with, we've got nothing.
I think one of the interesting things is in the social sector, politics matters a lot, right? And
right.
Often when you say politics is a bad thing. But one of the great things about politics is politicians are really good at moving people with rhetoric. They're good at taking ideas and expressing those ideas. And I think what big data needs is rhetoric on top. It needs people that are able to take the data that's bubbling up and the stories that are in the data, but then weave those into compelling ideas that move people. And actually marketing is going the other way. Marketing's becoming more like politics. Marketing's becoming very tribal at the moment. So in the poverty area, for example, the key would be to make it socially desirable for more people to want to be part of the tribe that's helping solve poverty, in the same way that it's socially desirable to put a green bin outside of your door to show that you're environmentally responsible.
Yeah.
And I think that's the sort of thing that you can't miss. You can't just analyze data and have piles and piles of data unless you've got a real deep human connection to people that makes them want to be part of your tribe and behave differently as
Absolutely.
a result.
You know, to that point, I didn't give a quick case, but I wrote the strategy for Seventh Generation, the healthy, organic, chemical-free household products. And you know, it was very much about, the perennial problems where it costs more, how do we justify that? It doesn't work as well, how do we justify that? It doesn't work as well and it costs more, how do we justify that? And it's pretty ugly. And if anybody's worked in the green space, that's what you're up against all the time. And I won't give you the whole case study, but basically we had to get to, and also it's the circle of concern. That's another thing, like I care about me, I care about my family, maybe I care about my next door neighbor, maybe. I'll say I do in a questionnaire, but I don't, et cetera. How do you get them to care about the planet? And what we found, I don't know if it was the answer, but it seemed to have done quite well, is the idea that we need to redefine what clean means. We need to define that clean is something that's in us, that clean is something, it's in our communities, it's in our soul, it's in our vision. And you know what, maybe the t-shirt isn't as white. Maybe that's creepy. Maybe a really, really, really white, cleaner than clean, oh my God, hate the dirt, 1950s way of being in the world. Maybe that's creepy. So it was the notion of just redefining what clean is and where it's found, And that's something that did come out of data. Absolutely, but it also came out of deep listening, ethnographies, connecting the dots, listening to what people didn't say, and even doing some old-fashioned focus groups, if you do them the right way, So.
Mm-hmm. And especially for David and Catherine, do you see, so if we think of the traditional or a systematic approach, and certainly the one that you've outlined, to developing strategy as being collection of data, generation of insights, development of the strategy, do you see your technologies as fundamentally altering that process, or just providing better inputs in some of the upfront pieces?
I mean, from my perspective, the huge power of software is the ability to accelerate human beings, but not to replace human beings. So, one of the things the ad business is really good at, it's not good at a lot of things, but it's really good at taking giant amounts of data and boiling it down to one idea that you can express in 30 seconds, right? That's a really difficult thing to do. But most of the time, that's what you're trying to do with your data, right? You're trying to take a huge amount of data and boil it down to something that's compelling in a very short space of time. And if you're trying to do that, you develop frameworks for doing that analysis of data. Now, the cool thing about software is you can take those frameworks, right? I can create a framework that says, what do people value in the world? What are the 12 things, when people talk about great value, what do they talk about? I can build that linguistic framework out, and then in the ad business, I would have built it once, thrown it away, moved on, started again. In my new world, I can build it once, bake it in the software, and now a 22-year-old right out of Stanford can come in and use that same framework for analyzing data and be accelerated in their ability to get good insights out of the data. And so I think that, for me, is the really exciting thing, is you're not removing, it's not just data, it's data plus frameworks for analytics on top, plus insights that turns into something, rhetoric that moves people. You need all those building blocks. And if you try and miss one out, nothing's going to change, right? I've had great data reports that I've walked into clients 100 times and gone thud on the table, and it sat there, right? Unless I can move them as a human being, then the data's worthless. So I think all those things need to connect.
I mean, I think certainly in marketing and advertising, it's still you need the story, you need the human element. So, but there's a huge amount of acceleration that can be done with software, and even when we're talking about the kind of software that learns domains, so you don't have to build the framework and reuse it; it just builds the framework automatically on top of it, which is what we do. And one day you're doing oilfield services, the next day you're doing cat food, right? And it's just boom, it learns it. But I think there always has to be that human element on top of it, because the computer doesn't know how to tell the story that will resonate with the brand, will resonate with the consumers. And I think getting to the point where the storyteller can tell that story faster is certainly one of the things that analytics technology can do for marketing. When it comes to something like product development, it's a little bit different, because I think in that world, there's a little bit more of a ground truth that can be found there. So you've got 4 product prototypes. You want to know which ones are going to resonate more with consumers. You can measure that. You can measure what people's perception of clean over time, and you can see how it's changing based on your ad campaign, and boom, you can just get that number. And there's a lot more ground truth there. And the same thing can kind of go in some ways once you get a campaign off the ground. So we're working on, I don't know if people have seen the anti-smoking ads, the really scary ones that some people are nodding here. Yeah. So we were working on that and looking at that data after the fact. There was really a great impact in consumers, and you can measure with individuals and with the community as a whole how associations between smoking and fear and wanting to change, how those numbers change over time before and after seeing something like this ad. And so when you go back to reevaluate how different things were effective, how the story you told played out, I think that there's definitely something that can be done there that's a little bit deeper.
Absolutely. But I don't disagree with that at all. I think you're spot on. But my experience in the design world tells me that even at the product level, there isn't a distinction, a hard distinction between product development and, say, advertising, in the sense that it should, whatever this thing is that's going to build delight and acceptance and drive the narrative, it has to be baked in from the very beginning, So like in experience, like for instance, I was a mutual friend of ours, I won't name his name, but a person who's known in the design space was doing a side project. We were doing it together, and it had to do with remaking the experience of divorce through a mobile app.
Oh, that's way wild.
Yeah, I'm hoping that was not irony, it started out with, okay, well, here's some sliders, and you'll find out how much you're going to owe or how much you're going to lose, and if this makes sense financially. All right, that was before I got there. And then I got there, and I started, and I won't bore you with all details, but it was basically, what's the human side of this? Like, what, is there a way to re-envision what this experience is like? Is there a way, because it's so common, is there a way to make it a rite of passage of some kind? Is it a way that focuses on healing and new beginnings? Is there a way to do it with dignity for all the parties? And suddenly, this little 5-slider app, which started with, am I going to get screwed at the bank, turned into something along the lines of, how can we really bring something more beautiful to something that's extremely painful? Now, you're all wondering, what happened with the app? Here's what happened with the app. I'm 13 years out of my divorce and very happily remarried. He's about a year out of his divorce, and he was so close to it that he just said, I can't do it, man, I just can't do it, and he took a job. So that's what happened to that app. But the idea is that even at the product design level, there's a way to bring in sentiment, if you will, and broader narrative contexts that can affect people's experience.
But this is probably true in the social space as well, which is to make certain choices and to make certain decisions when you're designing something that's like a product, something that goes out there. You really actually need to have data that shows that there's going to be an ROI.
Oh, absolutely.
You can't go out there on a story.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because you need to say, we were working with a large, all of my stories are going to be, this was a large consumer goods company because we do business intelligence and product design, and I can't ever name names. But this was a large sort of toiletry product company, and they were working on designing a new men's toiletry product. And so if I ask anybody in this audience, and everybody knows this problem, whether or not color factors in the way men buy toiletry products, all the men will say no in studies. And that's not something they could put numbers on because all the men say no in studies.
Right.
But if you give the people 4 different product prototypes and you put them in the homes of consumers for a while and you let them use them, 2 things will come out. One of which is that some guys will start talking about the color. Very small number. But some guys will start talking about the color. The other thing is that people will talk differently, and you can do it and you can prove it on a numbers level. If you actually have the ability to understand text, you can prove it on a numbers level. People will talk differently about the more brightly colored prototypes, and you can quantify that difference in the way people talk. And then that's when you go to the design firm.
Absolutely.
With that.
Absolutely.
And which is what they did. And then they
absolutely.
Released that product, and it was their best-selling men's toiletry product in a long time.
And that's wonderful because it takes away a burden from a lot of qualitative researchers. Right. Because very often a qualitative researcher will find themselves doing poor person's quantitative. Like, get 20 people in a room and do a show of hands. How many people like the blue one? And it's like, that is so bad on so many levels that we won't waste your time talking about it. But something like that, it's true, it's reliable, it's meaningful, it's really, really good, and it's not something we could get before. And then that gives us the freedom then to go out qualitatively and talk about what blue means to people.
Exactly.
You know, just what is the world of blue, among many other things we could do, you know. And then you get somewhere.
We did a study in 2006. We were interested, does sentiment correlate with sales? And so with Northwestern, we spent from 2006 to 2008 with a bunch of PhDs analyzing all sorts of sales data, share data, sentiment data, buzz data, and we found pretty definitively that sentiment does not correlate very well with sales. And one of the reasons is you can like a lot of products at the same time, right? I might like Toyota, I might like Lexus, I might like Honda. I could like all those products, but I'm not going to go buy all of those products. The only thing that correlated was advocacy. A lot like politics again, right? Am I going to tell you, my friend, that you should go out and buy this product, get involved in this cause, make a difference? Those are the things that really drive things because we're tribal people. And so I think that's really important to understand, that when you're looking for metrics, don't be lured by this word sentiment, because it's a false guard. Understand a bit more deeply than sentiment what's going to drive our action, which is advocacy.
And what drives the advocacy?
It's not
what drives the advocacy, that's the key. That's the bit, unless you understand that, you understand nothing.
So part of it is, part of what's driving the advocacy as well, what we found is people actually being able to understand and visualize impact. So if you talk more concretely about doing something, so let's say you're going to, this is something that we've done with purchasing products, but I'm sure it's true in the social space as well, and with health changes. If you say you want to do something, but you talk about it in big, lofty terms, you're not actually going to do it. You're only going to do it if you talk concretely about the steps that you're going to take to do it. If you're thinking of donating, you talk about what you think the outcomes are going to be of that, then you're much more likely to go out there and do it. And that's so much more predictive than sentiment. I think you hoped you were going to get a panel that had more debate about sentiment, but you've got three of us who are agreeing here.
I think there's plenty of other debate to be had.
That's true.
With that, I'd like to shift the conversation a bit and then actually open it up to you for questions and comment as well. So as we think about social sector applications, so these wonderful technologies and ability to process data and more understanding about how humans behave more rapidly, what are the biggest applications that you see for social sector problems, either for specific problems or specific ways of solving the problem that you don't think the social sector has yet adopted, beyond clearly the technologies and methods that you're talking about?
From my end, the most successful projects we do all start with hypotheses, right? You start with a hypothesis, and then what the data allows you to do is test those hypotheses against real discussions people are having. So maybe you walk in and your hypothesis is, if people could fix their houses up, they wouldn't need to move and they'd be happier, right? So then maybe that's your hypothesis. So then you can go in and analyze data in certain sectors and say, well, what are people talking about? What are the problems they have? What are the biggest problems they have? Let's quantify that. How are other people solving them? How can I connect the dots? Where are people talking about this stuff? How can I share that data? Or you might find out, no, people that live in squalor don't have the interest in fixing up their houses. They need somebody else to do it for them, right? So, my hypothesis is wrong. But I think having a hypothesis and then having the ability to go into the data and roll around and test the hypotheses is far and away more powerful than just hoping the data will tell you the answers. It's much more like a detective job than it is anything else. So that would be, I think in the social sector, have good hypotheses and then go find the data that's the right data to test your hypotheses in.
I would agree. I'll just restate it differently. I would just restate it. I think there's an opportunity to save the provider, the client, from themselves. There's been many, many, many times where well-intended, well-educated, well-experienced, terrific, smart, great people have had terrific ideas about what should be done, what the product should look like, what the policy should look like, what the service should look like in the private sector, public and nonprofit. And almost all many, many times, if you go out and you deeply listen to the world, you find out that either isn't correct, in fact could backfire terribly, or it's not the right lever to be pulling to build the relationship or begin the relationship. Just a quick case study that's actually from the private sector, and I think I've probably told you this story once. I was working with Creative Labs. There's Cambridge Soundworks was, if people back east would know them, and it was when home theater was happening and e-commerce was happening. It was just starting to happen. And we came into the meeting and they said it's all going to be about cutting edge site functionality. So just find a really funny, charming way to say that and make the ads. And, you know, and the same thing actually happened in a hotel business I worked with. Same thing, it's an operations solution. And you have to go back to them and say, listen, you can lose there, but you can't win there because just like milk, nobody cares. Cutting edge site functionality, are you kidding me? You know, that's cost of entry. You're excited, so here's what you do. Get everybody else internally excited, but we did a bunch of research and we found out it's a couple of things. For men, it's bragging rights. I got a big subwoofer, all right, at home theater stuff. For women, it was like knowing where the family was and knowing that they're in the basement and everybody's safe. And for everybody, it was family togetherness. It wasn't about cutting edge site functionality. So we said, instead of, going in there and just saying, this is Jim, he's our head engineer. We call him Mr. Functionality around here. Instead, we said, put up recipe contests for nachos. Do a tie-in with Barca Lounger. We do things called creative briefs, which is like the idea in when you brief the creatives, and you go from the information to the insight to the idea. And it was, in this case, it's Martha Stewart with a big ass subwoofer. That was it. And that's verbatim what it said. And the creative people got excited, and the client bought in. They finally understood. So a lot of the times, it really is pivoting from the initial idea that the expert technocrat thinks it is to connecting with real people in the language, frames, symbols, experiences, and emotions that they have. Because until you make that connection, you've really got nothing. And autocracy is too expensive. So you need to connect and be invited in. So I think that's similar. Good listening.
Yeah, I also got to agree. So more agreement, unfortunately.
Damn you.
But I think one of the other things that's important there is exactly what you were saying in the marketing context, which is that people come in with an idea of what they want to find and expect you to find it in the data, and that becomes a problem. And I think we run a series of webinars called The Guide to Good Data. I can't tell you how many times in the consumer realm people have come in with something like 10% of Twitter and are trying to find their brand in it, or are trying to solve a problem with text analytics that should be solved with network analytics or various different other sorts of things. So I think you have a problem that is your actual problem that you were trying to solve, and it's with data, and it's not always the problem that you will walk up to the data scientist and say. So I think if I can, as a data scientist, say something, it's always talk about the problem that you're trying to solve, and then we can work to see whether or not the data and the methods are there to support that. And I think that's really important. And that flips us back to social, which is that in a lot of questions that are being addressed by the social, by you guys, basically, I'm not sure the data is there in social. I'm not sure people are talking. Social is a very specific demographic, and people who are very prolific in social is a very, very specific demographic, and it's not always the one you're trying to reach. And I think that's a problem we see a lot in the commercial realm, which is that people who are looking to get feedback from consumers go out there and react to social, but those people are not their consumers. Those people are not the people who are buying their product. And so they're changing their message based on the social stuff, and those are not who their target audience is. And I think you really run that risk when you're looking at social specifically. If we do a lot of internal data work. So we do a lot of work on what comes out of surveys, open ends, focus groups, other sorts of things, and we combine that sometimes with social, but you'll see basically the satisfaction scores you see in the surveys and the satisfaction scores you see out of social. Social is about 10 times more bumpy, and it goes off on tangents, and it does all these other things. But you really want to be taking data from a wide variety of places and combining them together to see and make conclusions in the end. So that would be my caution with social, is that it might not be the people you're looking to actually pull.
Can I add one thought to that? Because I agree with that. I think the other side of that, though, is it might be that the solution to a lot of social problems is to get social in people's hands. Because the answers to a lot of their problems, like how can I make more money, how can I save my money better, how can I eat more efficiently, exists already in the data, but they don't have access to that data, and they don't have access to those answers. And a bit like the internet has provided a generation of people with new information that people that aren't on the internet don't have. It may be that social is not a media. Social is an age, right? This is like the Industrial Revolution. It's transforming society. It's transforming every aspect of society. And it may be that that's the answer is, yes, you're right. You can't analyze the data because those people aren't there. But the solution is...
But there's a lot of stuff online, and how do you know what to trust? And that becomes a big problem.
Well, that becomes the role
And
of
if we look, especially when we look at health, and I mean, we've
folks.
come in with a lot of pharma companies and trying to help investigate, well, what are people actually saying about these conditions, about these drugs, or any of these things? How much of it is accurate, right? And, if we remove people who have an agenda from the equation, the people that are left, what are they talking about? What are their concerns like? And I think being able not just to give people access to information, but to give people an idea of what information they can trust is going to be very important as social goes forward as a venue.
Huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
When you say social is a very special demographic, do
Yeah.
you mean social media
Yep, I mean
participants?
social media participants. I mean,
Okay.
the people on Twitter are a very
Ah.
small percentage of consumers, of people in the world. The people who use Facebook, much smaller, demographic than
Social.
Can you,
But can I just-
Catherine, can you provide a couple of characteristics?
I really should be able to, but I can't off the top of my head.
I've looked at this quite
yeah.
deeply. I mean, I think there's a couple of thoughts, though. One is to realize that in traditional research, the people that go to a focus group and the people that answer a telephone survey are a very small proportion of society, right? So just because the people on social media are a small proportion of society, it doesn't mean they're not a representative proportion of society. The other thing is that social media now is so pervasive. Facebook is the third largest country in the world by number of members, right? After India and China, bigger than the US. It's so pervasive that the demographics have really spread. I mean, I've done surveys on postmenopausal women talking about osteoporosis. I mean, this is like 70 plus. And there's plenty of good insights to get out, even if it's a relatively small group of people. So I don't know if that's helpful, but...
I mean, it's also, I have the inverse stories, right? That people have come to agencies we've worked with, have come to us with essentially data emergencies where they've done that study and they didn't get anybody. Yeah. And it's really hard to predict when you're going to get what you just said and when you're going to get, wow, nobody who we can identify as a DC influencer is talking about these things, or no one, Midwestern, people aren't talking about these things online.
We should talk data.
Yes.
Why don't we open the floor from some discussion and comment?
Can't you just look at the data itself in social and see if it is predictive and see if it is actually and see what the
Sure.
right. So you know right away, like you're using it as another data source. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think it might be more in the consumer space than it is in B2B, right? So I'm all over Facebook, I'll admit it, but I'm not about my business, right? So I might use Twitter or other channels for my business interactions and my LinkedIn, and I'll use Facebook for my personal stuff.
I think one of the
and the data will
challenges
tell
is,
you whether or not it's actually useful.
Twitter and Facebook's getting all the buzz, but all the mother load of insights is in forums and news groups. So
Absolutely,
that's
absolutely.
inside baseball, but
Absolutely.
the simple explanation of that is go to the right data source.
Exactly.
For the
Yep.
right-
And I think we run a webinar about that, but really there are specialized forums for everybody, for every demographic, for everything you're looking for, and that's where the data is. If you're looking for, I don't know, if you're a brand and you're looking for diabetes, people who use cosmetics, things like that, there are forums for all of these, and that's what you actually want to look at.
Just an irony, I'm a fanatic musician, so I participate in this music forum, and there's a part in there where you can talk about things other than music. And it's just, just doing what I do, it's been an amazing thing to go in there and look, because if you want to know what well-to-do, middle-aged, non-coastal, male, disaffected, flag-waving Tea Party paranoids are like, go to the gear page, pub section, because that's them. Somewhere along the way, guitar collecting became the thing of those people. And it's an extraordinary thing. And, I've been saying for a long time, it's like it's all in the forums. It's all in the forums.
It's all in the forums.
And there's also a lot of you'll find, I mean, you probably find it very useful over the years to find people's foibles as well, to find the things that bubble up that are actually just, weird blockages or even things that are toxic because they're there.
I find the most useful way to think about social data is just like the bookstore, right? You walk in Barnes & Noble, there's a magazine rack, and there's all these passions lined up, right? Food, parenting, cars. That's exactly how the social universe is organized. And so if you want to understand what human beings are passionate about, you can go into the social web and find that out. Right?
It really depends on whether or not you consider all of that data social or not. Whether it's not a social network, right? It's something that's been around longer than we had the word social. I mean, there have always been forums for these things, and this has always been where these people have talked.
Elizabeth, did you have a question?
I was just wondering, from each of your perspectives, when we think about the constituents of the social work, essentially, what a lot of social missions and foundations are endeavoring to do is to change the lives of people. And what occurs to me in sort of in our capitalistic world, you've got sort of the action, the person that's taking the action, coupled to the sentiment or coupled to the emotion. Let's just use that term because I agree with you. A sentiment is sort of a proxy for that. But here they're disjointed. In other words, that the buyer is not the recipient, and we know that.
That's right.
So I wonder if you could each talk about how you think about that problem in the context of just making it real for the foundations in the room, to think about how do they absorb this?
I think you have to understand both audiences. That is a great question.
That's right.
You have to understand, it would be the equivalent with Alzheimer's patients. You've got caregivers and you've got Alzheimer's patients, right? And actually both talk online. And you need to understand both sides to understand what's going on. And one of the models I think that's very important for that is a model of human motivation, right? There's 12 driving motivations that we have as man, right? They've come from our genetic survival over the 500,000 years we've been around. And they're things like the need to feel nurturing, or the need to feel creative, or the need to feel smart, right? Those fundamental drivers work all around the world, no matter where you are. And I think it's very important to categorize those things. So if you're going for a donor, you need to understand what are the motivations that might drive this donor. If you keep going up the why questions, all the way up to the top, what's the fundamental motivation that's going to get them to put their hand in their pocket? And for somebody that's in homeless, for example, what's going on with them? What's going to motivate them to want to change their situation? And is there a way to really understand what's driving those motivations, and how can you latch onto those motivations? Because as human beings, we don't really act very rationally, but we can't help ourselves but act on these survivalist core motivational drivers. And I found that out. Leah Burnett was one of the agencies I worked at. They sent me around the world and said, why do people buy Green Giant peas just as much in Pyongyang as they do in Peoria? And that came out of analyzing that and finding out those are the fundamental drivers of man.
Well, they both
and if you
start with
understand
peas.
those, and they both start with P. Did that answer your question, or was that a rambling? No, not really. All right, you try. Phil, she's hard to satisfy.
All right.
Your turn.
All right.
You try.
I'll try. Okay. Well, I have a model, but I've narrowed it down to 5 from David's 12 because he doesn't know my 5, I don't know his 7, but that's a similar thing. It's a couple of things. When I first started working in B2B, doing this kind of work, my boss said to me, B2B buyers are people too. There may be committees, but they're people too, and they have emotional landscapes and they live within narrative frameworks. So what I find is I think it's really important to understand the world, the assumptions, the models, all that stuff I talked about, of the people who are the buyers and the people who are the beneficiaries, the end users, however you want. I just think in a sense it kind of doubles the amount of work you have to do. And you have to speak truth. I mean, one of the nice things about what people like us do is we do get to speak truth. And when people say like advertising, for instance, is lying to people and giving them what they don't want, well, that's very ineffective advertising. You talk to people inside advertising and they think it's extremely weak. It doesn't have the power. And when it does have power, it's actually based in some kind of truth. And I would argue that, I had an analogy in my head a second ago, whereas that advertising might be there might be the perception that advertising is trying to get people to do things that they don't want to do. I think it might be true to say in the social sector that experts are trying to visit things upon beneficiaries who they haven't listened to. So it's kind of good for somebody, I'm available, but there are other people too, to come in and say, listen, here's what we really, well, sort of. But I said there's other people too, and then this eyelash moved in your direction. But it was subconscious. I didn't mean to do it, to tell you the truth. But to truly deeply listen to both groups of people and to come in and speak truth, and to do so, I wrote a blog post recently about what does it mean to be a prophet. And having been a person who studied religion, people think that prophet means a soothsayer, a person who, it's in the prophecy, it's the future, and that's not what it is. Prophets were people who spoke truth to power, who brought people back to a moral core and held the identity of a people. All right? So there is a prophetic notion or aspect of what we do, which is to come in and say, this is what we learned, this is what's true, suck it up, it's not cutting-edge site functionality. And I just think it becomes a little more time-consuming and expensive because you're kind of doing two different audiences, and the gears might grind. But, you're always free to ignore the consultant.
Was that a better answer? Well, yes.
Well, there you go, my friend.
It sounded better to me.
So I'm going to just disagree slightly that the consultant, I spent a good portion of my life in the consulting world in B2B enterprise, and we're motivated by whoever's paying our bill, right? To show them that campaign worked, or show them that, Cisco, you really should be spending all your money on advertising and March Madness because the VP of advertising really thinks that that's what that is. And, I'm there to actually prove their goals and help them because and then they're motivated by ego and everything else when you're in that world. So I think what I was mentioned earlier about taking the humans out of it, humans set up the problem, and then if you can operationalize the end result and let that go directly into your downstream systems, because the software does have that kind of power, that sometimes when we get in there, we want to say we're speaking truth. And I think we all feel that, but we have these egos and these other motivations that when you put a person in it and start looking at the data, they have a bias. And so the more you can take that away, allow humans to set up the problem, allow humans to put the data back into the systems that are going to act and help you determine the right advertising to use and determine the right products to build. But try to take all that interpretation out of it, because when we have that, I just think that I see it, that's my own humble opinion, that there's a lot of bias and strong opinions.
You're both right.
Yeah.
In different verticals, basically. So we do features for predictive analytics. We do a lot of things that I haven't talked about yet here. And there are places where you don't want the person in the loop at all. We have systems. They sit there, they run. Text comes in, numbers come out. It goes into something like BigQuery, and inventory comes out the other end. And you don't want a person in the loop because the person is going to make those assumptions. They're going to buy all the Windows phones because everybody's excited about them, whereas in reality, everyone's excited about it because it's something different, but no one's actually going to buy it, and you can do that with the numbers. But then there's the creative aspect of things where you need to tell a story to somebody, and then you want to add, and more in the market, when you need to convince somebody of something, there's always a human element of that as well. And that might not be true in the place where you want somebody to go through a website in a certain way that will, maximize involvement. You can do all that without a person in the loop. But there's something about actually building something creative that I think people still need to be there for. So in different places, it's essentially both that.
Right? So to put the creative, put it through an experiment, have your goals set up ahead of time. And then that's going to drive whatever we're going to go forward with and how we're going to do this, as opposed to...
Oh, yeah. Did any of us answer your question yet?
There's no answer to your question.
Right.
So we're talking about consumer sentiments for social change. Are we talking about, is the parallel here to the end beneficiary, or is the parallel to the nonprofit or social enterprise service provider, or is the parallel to the funder? So who's the direct parallel that we need to?
Depends on what question you have. I mean, if you want to understand each of those three people, you have to study each of those three people, right?
And sometimes to solve problem questions, you're going to have to.
Each one of them, because it's all about listening to what motivates that group.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you have to listen to everybody for certain things. Like, there's a lot of different places where you're developing something for somebody where there's an intermediary, be it parents and kids, be it caregivers, be it pet owners. And even when you develop even when you get, these are the things that are motivating, let's say the cat, and these are things that are motivating the cat owner. They don't line up necessarily. The cat owner likes the food. Even if the cat loves the food, if the cat owner thinks it's disgusting, they're never going to buy it.
Right.
Even if they know the cat loves the food. And no matter what you're doing, when you have that kind of relationship, you have to find the thing that appeals to everybody. So you actually have to essentially study all the different.
Right, but it's a different person buying the food than consuming the food, right?
Right,
And delivering
yes.
the food.
Yeah. So you have to understand all of those aspects, and you have to find a place where they all align and aim for that.
So how does that play out for? Do you have experience with cat food, or do you have experience with? I would think like youth products or kids
Yes.
products, like
Yes.
advertising to kids,
Yeah.
but the parents are the ones that have to buy
Yeah.
it. And I don't know if that's.
There's a
if
lot
it's-
of we can all say there's a lot of advertising parents.
I could have learned probably 5 foreign languages in the time I've spent sitting at a desk trying to figure out what the objective of a particular project is. Like, why are we marketing? Why are we communicating? Why are we saying? For whom? What is the one thing we're trying to affect? And you'd be amazed how many highly paid people have sat around in rooms for months at a time arguing about that kind of stuff. And the takeaway is that, the big joke is you never would get like a marketing brief from a client that says sell more stuff. That's not good enough. You have a right to go back to them and say, let's work on this. And you would never have a brief in the social sector that says stop poverty. The first job is to say, and this is a strategic task as well, but what lever are we trying to pull? With whom, why, how, why do we think that'll work? And then phase 2 is, well, how do we do that with great subtlety, deftness, and effectiveness?
And in what order? Like it might be I need to go raise $100 million. Now I need to take that $100 million and change behavior in a society.
Well, yeah.
And you might want to have a different way of engaging with the stakeholders at each step along that way. Because when you're raising the money, when you're going out and doing things, you have different messages and different sort of, even when you're running a nonprofit, you have different messages that you give the different stakeholders of the nonprofit in a way.
We once targeted, this just comes to mind, we once targeted individual print shop managers with a message that was new. We hadn't known this before. It was basically that at the time, these print shop managers were feeling squeezed by the promises of software providers and the expectations of their customers, because the software providers would say, it's perfect, it just does everything. And the consumer would say, it's perfect, it does everything, so how about an hour from now, half the price? How's that sound? And the printer was getting ready to jump out of a window. So we just went to them with a certain understanding, like we get it, and reflected their reality back to them, all right? And that made them much more amenable to working with our company, which happened to be AGFA, which is the European Kodak, to be their kind of software solutions provider. And then we built services that would help, that were all about supporting printers to transition to being automated workplaces. And the whole thing was driven by just reflecting their reality back to them. So that's very far away from sell more. That it sold more, but it did so by understanding more.
Meth is the same example of that. Until they showed empathy.
See, I never needed an ad for Meth. I just went right for it.
They couldn't engage with them until they showed empathy.
Yeah, there has to be that.
The same thing goes with smoking and stuff that we
So strategic focus is really, what I'd contribute to your question.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question I would like to ask before we close, and I'm sensitive to the time. But David, you mentioned earlier about this dynamic about meth users tweeting to one another and then finding recovering meth users and developing both opportunities to buy new drugs and opportunities to not take drugs anymore. That's like a really nice natural solution, or naturally, organically developed solution to this problem of how meth users can find resources. Is there any way that foundations could, in areas where there has not been that organic development of a solution, that foundations can seed the beginning of the development of said solution without killing it, without too much subsidy or perversion of the approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people come to me and ask, are people talking about this issue, for example? And we look, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. What I often say to them, if nobody's talking about the issue, is you need to find something that they are talking about, that they're interested in. And then you need to go work out how to lasso and attach that thing that they are talking about to what you'd like to talk about. So in the food category, for example, only 5% of all the conversations mention a brand, because people aren't terribly interested in talking about brands. So if you want to go connect with people in food, you need to work out, well, what do they care about? And social media is a great map for that, because it gives you a map of what are people energized to talk about. And if they're not energized to talk about it in today's society, you're in real trouble, because that social media has so much impact. You know, it's starting revolutions in Egypt. If you don't have anybody talking about your issue, then I think question one is not where else can I look, but how can I get people talking about it in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question?
100%.
Okay.
Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
very much agree with that. There are computational ways that have been studied to create networks of people that will talk about different things, but I think really when it comes down to it, the effective thing is going to be what you're talking about rather than some algorithmic solution.
Yeah, and I would just add that it reinforces the notion of a narrative framework, because they're part of a whole world. So find out what these same people are talking about and work your way into a conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, with that, thank you to the three of you for a wonderful conversation.